Much of what has been reported has been based on limited and partial intelligence. That reporting has been made without the benefit of the full context provided by all relevant materials. Experienced, intelligent professionals understand that individual pieces of intelligence must be viewed with considerable skepticism. It is extremely rare to draw conclusions, much less take action, from a single intelligence report. Each piece of intelligence is a brushstroke to paint a broader picture. Only upon seeing the full picture, with the benefit of all relevant intelligence, can one conclude that much of the reported intelligence has been misconstrued in media reports, presumably because of this lack of context in these instances. In some cases, the materials I reviewed tell a very different story than what has been reported to date.
Okay, more there from Special Rapporteur David Johnston on the intelligence that has been leaked to and reported on by the media. In his comments today, Johnston also took aim at the people who leaked that information, saying in his report it was unjustifiable and a risk to Canada's ability to gather intelligence. He says it is a matter of urgency that all efforts be made to identify and hold the leaker or leakers responsible. Malice cannot be ruled out. Well, Stephanie Carvin is an associate professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Professor Carvin specializes in issues of intelligence and national security. Malice was not a segue to you, it just lined up that way. Dennis Molinaro is a professor of legal studies at Ontario Tech University, and he previously worked as a national security analyst with the federal government, and they both join me now. Gang, so look, you've both been on talking about this. We all anticipated, Stephanie, starting with you, there's going to be a public inquiry, but there's not going to be a public inquiry. What's your reaction to that decision?
Well, I've been on your show before multiple times saying, there probably should be some kind of public inquiry. And I feel like we've all kind of come down to that there's hard no, that there's no public inquiry.
Yeah.
But the fact is there is going to be like public hearings,
yes.
right? So it's not like this is going to be in the dark. It's not like we're shutting the door and not having this. And one of the key things that I think we have been missing and is also missing in this report, maybe we can talk about that, but is the community perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So the opportunity for the community to...
The national security community, you
No,
mean?
sorry, I meant like the diaspora. Yeah, the people who are most affected by this. I mean, we only seem to be become interested in this after really it seems to have affected our elections. But the fact is this has been going on for decades. And for these diaspora groups to tell their story is, I think, very important, albeit as a number of people in the diaspora were saying today, and I think Joanna Chu was probably talking about that earlier, but and wrote about it, this will have to be done under very secure and safe conditions. It's not automatically that, if you're being harassed by a government, you're going to want to actually have your hearing protected and your identity protected. That's going to be something to be worked out.
Though, Dennis, we just had Chuck Kwan on the show, who's been advocating for this stuff for years, saying, I'm tired of talking. I'm going to do it, but like we've been telling them, and we wanted the public inquiry, and based on your tweets, you kind of agree with Chuck Kwan, maybe that they kind of blew it today.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit of a missed opportunity. I think it's... the problem is well, what's the reason for all of this to begin with, right? I mean, a lot of the motivation to do all of this was to restore trust, right? This was the idea here was, just trust us it's not going to be enough. There's got to be more. And the problem, I think, with how this is being, orchestrated, done going forward, is that there's not going to be enough to kind of alleviate those concerns. I feel like there needs to be more of a focus that would satisfy that.
Well, just pick up on that, Dennis, because there was a lot of criticism of the media in this, right? There was 9 or 10 examples that they go through and say, Global reported this, here's why it's wrong. The Globe reported this, here's some issues we have with it. But then it is constrained by the fact that these things are secret and intelligence and they can't show us their homework. Do you think that does the job? David Johnston saying this was wrong, you have to trust me, this was wrong.
Well, I mean, and this is part of the problem, right? I mean, a large focus of the report seems to be structured around what the media got right and what it didn't get right, or what, and we can't really get at that anyways, no matter what, because we never really could, because the vast majority of all this information is classified, and some's been spilled to the media. But I mean, the fact remains that you're not going to get, even with a public inquiry, you're not going to get all of a sudden the keys to the vault and everything's going to be spilled out in the open. That being said, I think a lot of what the reasoning that I get from the public and on Twitter and what have you is that the idea of a public inquiry is really as a means of building trust that there's going to be a very thorough, independent investigation to a lot of issues. Now, that being said, a lot of it would not be made public. That's fine. We've had commissions in the past, commissions of inquiry. We've had 6 that deal with national security. One of them specifically, the McDonald Commission, was more, I think, more geared to kind of what a commission could be like if it was going to go forward for a situation like this, where a lot of it's done in camera behind closed doors. A lot of it still remains classified, but it's at least done, it seems to be done by a former justice. There's subpoenas, they're calling witnesses and so forth. And a lot of people are being interviewed, and not just within the government, but within the national security sector, within the communities affected, and so on.
Right. So, Steph, any thoughts you have on that? But also, Johnston saying in his report, it's a matter of urgency that all efforts be made to identify and hold the leakers responsible. That's an interesting line.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the RCMP focus does seem to be on finding the leakers rather than, I would say, perhaps even finding the people doing foreign interference, which is something that does seem to be something of an issue going forward. But look, I agree very much with Dennis in the sense that transparency and the other word I heard a lot today was accountability, that a public inquiry is about accountability, right? And I mean, look, I mean, when I say like there's serious limits to a public inquiry, it's not, I don't want to people want to see this in a partisan lens, but I'm trying to just present it in kind of the reality of it.
There's certain things we can't see and we will never be able to see no matter what mechanism is chosen.
And I guess the other issue I have is it's not just that can't see, but I mean, this would take like 18 months, a year. We need to actually start working on this now. And we have 2 institutions, the National Security Intelligence Review Agency and the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which are doing the kind of work that a public inquiry would effectively do in this space, but they can do it in classified. So I think what this effectively does is it puts a lot of pressure on those 2 institutions to make their reports as transparent as possible, as legible as possible. I think that will help. I don't think it's going to solve any arguments, but then again, when was the last time a public inquiry solved any arguments in this country?
Well, you're not wrong there. But look, there's what we can't see, and then there's what people apparently don't see. Pages 18 and 19 of this report, I keep referencing these pages, but Steph, start with you. It's about these binders of intelligence that go out from the intelligence services into the government departments, and it's not at all clear if anyone is reading them at all. Large and undifferentiated binders, a lack of accountability about who is reading those binders or whose job it is to respond to what is contained in them is not what is required of the current era of international relations and the attendant threats. That's a fancy way of saying it's a bit of a mess in there.
Oh, it's a hot mess. It's not just a mess. The mess, it's a hot mess and the mess is on fire. And I know Dennis can, we're both former analysts. We both can attest to this. Yeah, no, it's discouraging that you kind of put your heart and soul into an assessment and you honestly don't know where it goes and who sees it. Sometimes you can call up your friends or your contacts in other departments and say, hey, you might want to check your email on the other side. And there's actually a point in there where, intelligence was provided to a minister on their classified network, but the minister at that time didn't have access to it, didn't see it, right? So this whole system is what's a mess. And this doesn't require legal change, it requires cultural change. And this is a place to start, but we shouldn't be starting 18 months from now, we should be starting now.
Right. So that example, Dennis, to get to you, is on page 27 for people reading along at home. And this is the Michael Chong stuff that became this big issue in Parliament, that there was information that China was gathering information on his family, looking to see if there's some sort of retaliation they could have. It was sent, this intelligence was sent to Bill Blair and his chief of staff at the time when he was the Minister of Public Safety. But it says, neither the minister nor his chief of staff received the memo. Both indicated, and we have confirmed with the public service, that they do not have access to the top secret network email on which it was sent. The Minister of Public Safety and his top political staffer didn't have email access to where this information was being sent. I mean, hot mess, to use Steph's phrase. Boy, that seems like a bit of an understatement on this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Steph is 100% right about all this. I mean, it is a disaster in the way information intelligence is being handled. And again, though, it speaks to, I mean, we have some very strange language, I find, in the report where there's an element where we can't have a public inquiry because of the classified nature of some of the, a lot of the material. Okay, but like I said, we've done that before. But then there's this other element where we do have to have public hearings about all of this other stuff. Well, isn't that an inquiry? I mean, it's very like it is, but it isn't. So I'm not really sure what the difference is here. But so this is the kind of problem I have with the findings that came out today, because this is a real problem, and this speaks to really the heart of the issue of who got information and what they did with it and what they didn't do with it, or what was seen, what was not seen, because of the information flows.
It's like Schrodinger's inquiry, right? Like it's happening, it's not happening, and we don't know who's read it and who's seen it. Anyway, Steph, final point to you.
I guess I would just say, I mean, like, look, I think I spent most of my Friday evenings with you last fall about this, and we learned just how, the fact that, like, this is messed up, that information isn't flowing well, that, people didn't think to pass on information, there's no automated processes. This is what we learned in the Public Order Emergency Commission. This isn't something that's totally brand new. We're seeing a lot more of it here. So, I mean, we really should get going with it forward. I don't know if a public inquiry is going to tell us that much more that we're not going to learn from NCIRA, that we're not going to learn from NSI Cop. And I don't say this because I have any particular partisan affiliation, but because we need to fix this. We need to fix this now.
Absolutely.
Nope. Yep. Yeah, no, just one last line from page 18. After conducting numerous interviews, the picture remains cloudy. The intelligence materials are disseminated, but no one keeps track of who specifically received or read them. That kind of underlines what we've been talking about for about 3 months. Gang, thanks so much. We'll have you back. There's a lot more to talk about here. Stephanie Carvin, Dennis Molinaro. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, so as we've been discussing, David Johnston's much anticipated first report into foreign interference has ruled out a public inquiry, recommending public hearings instead.
There have been widespread calls for a public inquiry from media, opposition parties, and Parliament through a motion passed in the House of Commons. When I began this process, I thought I would come to the same conclusion, that I would recommend a public inquiry. Well, it would have been an easy choice. It would not be the correct one.
Johnston says any public inquiry would be subject to severe limitations on what can and can't be shared with the public, and it would cover the same ground he did with this report. Here to discuss this story is Richard Fadden. He's a former CSIS director and a former National Security and Intelligence Advisor. Richard Fadden, welcome back to the studio.
Good to be with you.
So David Johnston said today, you had been advocating an inquiry. He thought he was going to recommend an inquiry, but he says that would have been the easy choice, but not the correct one. What do you make of that conclusion?
Well, I think with the greatest respect to, I think, a very distinguished Canadian, that he's wrong on this point. Everything that he wants to have accomplished with the public consultations could be done by a public inquiry. A public inquiry could do a little bit more. I think one of the challenges that we really have right now is that it's going to be led by Mr. Johnston. I really do believe he's a distinguished Canadian whose integrity should not be impugned. But that's neither here nor there. You know better than I that perception is more important than reality in many things today, and he is not perceived as being independent. And while I think everybody would have appreciated his description of his relationship with the government, it's not going to change people's mind. They think there's the perception of impartiality, and that is not going to contribute to Canadians taking his report seriously.
So when you say people, do you mean all Canadians, the average Canadian here? Are we talking about elite opinion inside the political bubble? Because there's a different ferocity to that discussion in those circles than there is, at the grassroots level.
Yeah, I think that's fair ball. I don't think Canadians, generally speaking, wake up in the morning and, the first thing they're going to say is, my God, David Johnston's recommendation 43, let's talk about it over our croissant. And that's just our reality. I think there's far too much hyperbole attached to this from the political class in Ottawa. So I do mean Ottawa, the media generally, right, universities, think tanks, and to some degree those Canadians who are concerned about these issues.
He essentially, in this report, absolved the Liberal government of wrongdoing or negligence when it comes to acting on recommendations or ignoring intelligence, but he raised really serious concerns about how intelligence is shared and consumed across government. Binders going out to departments, no clear record of who's reading it and where that information is actually going. What's your sense of those findings?
Well, I think that certainly takes place sometimes. I spent a couple of years as the Deputy Minister of National Defence, and I can assure you that they knew where their intelligence was. Mm-hmm. When I was National Security Advisor, I had people chase me, making sure that I didn't leave papers around. I think it was similar in CSIS. But I do think it boils down to, again, Canadians, including public servants and politicians in Ottawa, don't worry about national security on a day-to-day basis. When there's a crisis, people focus, and I think as a country we respond really quite well. But you know, if you're very, very busy, either as a public servant or as a minister, and you know there's nothing urgent in the binder, you're not going to pay as much attention to it as you would if you were an American or a British or a French public servant or minister. So I would argue that, you know, some of the recommendations that Mr. Johnston is making that the Prime Minister may well put into place will help, but they will not make a big difference until Canadians generally and their elected representatives accept that national security generally and foreign interference is a real day-to-day problem that we have to worry about, as much as we worry about social policy or economic policy.
There is this first report, 55 pages. It's all the stuff that can be released publicly, but there's an appendix that has all the confidential information with footnotes in it linking to the raw intelligence. This is being offered to all of the opposition leaders to come in and read it. They would be bound by the same sort of secrecy laws as the ministers if they do. To get to the bottom of this and bring some clarity to what's going on, do you think they should take them up on the offer and look at that?
It's a generous offer on the part of the Prime Minister, which I think his predecessors haven't made very often. But I think in some ways it's the rough equivalent of saying to you, tomorrow morning, here's a book on general surgery, have a look at it, and the next day you're going to take out my appendix. And I'm not saying that entirely jokingly. National security and intelligence is a world of its own. It's not better or more important, it's just different. And taking Mr. Singh or Mr. Pulver, Mr. Blanchette, and sort of saying, read this stuff and you will all of a sudden understand how everything that's gone on is picture perfect is an unreasonable requirement. I would argue that the more fundamental issue is that in a small c constitutional sense, our Parliament doesn't receive enough classified information. The Brits and the Australians receive far more than we do. I think they should attack it at that level. I can't imagine the three leaders accepting it because the instant they accept it, they can't use the information.
Right. Well, really, Jagmeet Singh says he will, but Mr. Poilievre says
I didn't hear that. Well, that's interesting because it will really bind him. But I really think that it's also asking a lot of these leaders just to immerse themselves in foreign intelligence for, I don't know, a day or two and expect them to understand how it's collected, why it's collected, how it's aggregated, what's ours, what belongs to the Allies, and then make sense of it. If he accepts it and he understands it, that's all to the good, but I still think the basic small c constitutional change would also help.
Well, Michael Chong has certainly argued similar things, right? That Parliament needs to have more oversight. Now, there is a committee of parliamentarians. It's not a parliamentary committee. NSICOP, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians appointed by the Prime Minister. But there are Conservatives on that. The Bloc is on that. The NDP is on that. Mr. Johnston says this organization should review my findings, look at the intelligence, and if they disagree, say it publicly. What do you make of that check and balance being offered by the Special Rapporteur?
I think they would have done so even if he hadn't made the offer, to be perfectly honest. But there's a problem with NSCOP. I think it was a good initiative at the time the Trudeau government put it into place, but it has had real difficulties in keeping membership from all the parties. I think it is still, to a considerable degree, an executive branch body, even though public reports are released to Parliament. So is it a useful thing to do? Yes, but this does not tremendously promote transparency.
This report is also highly critical of a lot of the reporting. There's an 8 to 10 page section there where it goes through various headlines and various dates, says here's what I've looked at the intelligence and here's what it says. There's no indication that the leakers are going to stop leaking. I mean, what do you make of what David Johnston says about the reporting on this and the possibility there could be even more based on future leaks?
Well, he has an advantage over you and I because we haven't seen the basic information. I don't see any indication anywhere that the leaks are going to stop. I think he's right when he says that context is important, but I would also counter to some degree. It's very hard to take a discrete piece of intelligence that, you know, consular official X was doing Y. That's one thing. But an aggregated analysis that looks at these things over a number of years, a couple of which were reported in the Globe and Mail, are something entirely different. So to condemn discrete pieces of intelligence as not making sense without context, I think makes a great deal of sense. The broader reviews and analysis, I think, are at least an attempt to contextualize and to make things more easily understandable.
He also recommends, just as a final point, that efforts should be made to find the source of the leaks because he says you cannot rule out malice as a motivation there. What's your thoughts on that?
I think he's right. I've said all along, I think I've said to you the last time I was here, I think leaking national security information is a bad thing. However, it's been leaked and we can't ignore it. And the one sort of thing that I take out of all of this that is even slightly positive, had these leaks not occurred, we would not be having these conversations. The Prime Minister would not have been on television today. Mr. Johnston would be at his farm enjoying life. We need to talk about these things more than we have been in the past. I think it's just really unfortunate that it took national security leaks to enable us to do it.
Former CSIS Director Richard Fadden, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.